What you most want to find will be found where you least want to look. There's this old story that's from King Arthur, and King Arthur has these knights, right? They all sit around a round table, which means they're roughly equal. That's what the round table means. And they're off to find the Holy Grail, and the Holy Grail is the most valuable object. That's what it means. So they're off to find the most valuable thing, but they don't know what it is, and they don't know where it is. But they know that there's a most valuable thing, so in some sense it's akin to them orienting themselves by the star. And they don't know where to look, and so what they decide is, they have the castle, and it's the middle of a forest, and so each knight decides to start looking for the Holy Grail by entering the forest at the point that looks darkest to him. And so what's the idea there? Well, imagine there are things that come easy to you, and that you're fond of pursuing, and that you're happy about pursuing. So you've found those and pursued them, and you've mastered them. So you know all that, but then there's another place that you don't want to go. And so you haven't gone there, and you haven't mastered it, and you're very small in comparison to it because you haven't mastered it, and so it has this monstrous aspect. If what you're doing isn't working, it's where you haven't gone that you need to go. And so I can give you another example of this. So let's say you're an agreeable person, and so you don't like conflict, and you won't stand up for yourself, and you regard anger and the proclivity to provoke and to engage in conflict as something that's positively terrible. It's not only that you're not good at it, it's actually that it's wrong. So that's where you have to go if you're going to learn how to stand up for yourself. And imagine that you're afraid. Maybe you have something like agoraphobia. And so there's a whole bunch of things that you're afraid of, and you don't want to go there. But if you want to put yourself together, then that's exactly where you have to go. And so it's frequently the case that what you want to find is to be found where you least want to find it. And that idea is echoed in the prominent stories of dragons and gold. It's exactly the same idea. The dragon is this terrible thing. It's this terrible predatory thing that lives forever and is very, very wise. And it lives underground, and it'll kill you. It'll burn you up in a second. But it hoards gold. And so you have to go there into the dragon's lair if you're going to get the gold. And that's a representation of people's paradoxical relationship with reality. It's like you have to go out there and confront it in order to incorporate what it has to offer to you. But the probability that that's going to be intensely dangerous and push you right to the limit, first of all, those are actually the same thing. If it didn't push you to the limit, you wouldn't gain anything valuable from it. So you don't get one without the other. You don't get the gold without the dragon. That's a very strange, very, very strange idea. But it seems to be accurate. Frodo, right? It's not, or it's Bilbo. It's Bilbo in The Hobbit. You know, he's kind of this little underdeveloped, overprotected Shire dweller, and he's called on a great adventure to go and find the dragon. And he has to become a thief in order to manage it. Well, that's pretty weird. You know, it's like, well, it's because as a good citizen, he's just not enough to conquer a dragon. He has to also become a bad citizen in some sense. He has to incorporate the part of himself that's monstrous, let's say, and develop that and hone it. And that's to say that, well, if you're harmless, you're not virtuous. You're just harmless. You're like a rabbit. A rabbit isn't virtuous. It just can't do anything except get eaten. It's not virtuous. If you're a monster and you don't act monstrously, then you're virtuous. But you also have to be a monster. Well, you see this all the time. Harry Potter's like that too. It's like he's flawed, he's hurt, he's got evil in him. He can talk to snakes, man. He breaks rules all the time. All the time. He's not obedient at all. But, you know, he has a good reason for breaking the rules. And if he couldn't break the rules, him and his little clique of rule-breaking, you know, troublemakers, if they didn't break the rules, they wouldn't attain the highest goal. So it's very peculiar, but it's a very, very common mythological notion. You know, the hero has to be a monster, but a controlled monster. Batman is like that, you know. I mean, it's everywhere. It's the story you always hear.
Is this where morals become ethics?
Meaning, we have to be more precise.
I feel like, because everyone's moral, but in order to become ethics, you have to refine the morals, and so you have to kind of go into.
Well, that's a good question, because one question is, you're kind of implicitly moral insofar as you're socialized, but that's sort of procedural. It's just built into you. This is different. This is also becoming conscious of it and expanding out your personality into dimensions that it wouldn't normally occupy. So this happens to people all the time. So, for example, lots of my clients, my clinical clients, are too agreeable, and they're generally women, because women are more agreeable than men, but not always, because I've had agreeable men as clients as well. And what happens is they're resentful, and they don't know how to stand up for themselves, and it's because they're very compassionate by nature. And so if you're entering into a negotiation with them, they'll let you win. Well, that's not so good, because you need to win too, especially if you're in an organization of adults where there's a struggle, right? When you have kids, you can let them win, especially infants. You have to let them win, and that's partly why compassion is so necessary. But as a basis for negotiation between adults, it's like, sorry, it's insufficient. You have to be a bit of a monster so that you can say no. And so a lot of what you do in psychotherapy is treat people's anxiety and depression. That's a huge chunk of it. Help them straighten out the way they think. That's a huge chunk of it. But another chunk of it is, well, let's toughen you up. Let's put you in a position where you can bargain. Let's teach you how to assert yourself and stand up for yourself, and that's assertiveness training, and it's a huge chunk of psychotherapy. And you need to learn it. It's like, because part of how you regulate your interactions with other people is to negotiate. And you cannot negotiate unless you can say no. You can't do it. And it causes conflict to say no, and if you don't like conflict, which is basically the definition of being agreeable, then you can't tolerate the conflict, and so then you can't negotiate on your own behalf, and so then you keep losing, and you're bullied, and it's not good. Then you get resentful, and it's really not good. So you have to develop your inner monster a little bit, and then that makes you a better person, not a worse person. It's weird, but that's just how it is. Imagine you had a fairly hostile father who was not very well controlled in his aggression. Decent person other than that, but let's say that. And so your reaction is, I'm never going to be aggressive. And so you've built a moral structure that's part of your personality. And there's possibility floating around outside of that you've denied any ethical, what would you say? You've stripped the idea of aggression of any ethical utility whatsoever. Okay, so what happens? This burns off, and then that comes back up. Now you still have to integrate it. So it's associated in some sense with Nietzsche's idea as morality as cowardice. Because one of Nietzsche's most trenchant critiques of traditional morality, let's say, is that most of what passes for morality isn't morality. It's just cowardice. It's not that I'm a good person and I don't hurt you. It's that I'm afraid to hurt you. And because I don't want to admit that I'm afraid to hurt you, then I say I'm moral, because then I can mask my essential fear and cowardice in a guise of morality. And that happens far more often than you would think, because harmless and moral are by no means the same thing. So some of what you're burning off, you can sit, and this is where Freud was such a genius, I think, is because he concentrated on aggression and sexuality, which are perhaps the two most difficult parts of a personality to integrate. Said that the hypersimplified morality stops you from tapping into deeper recesses of your psyche. And it's partly because they're primal forces. It's not surprising that you don't want to have anything to do with them, that you stay away from situations where they might make themselves manifest. But the problem is, by denying the worst in yourself in that manner, or suppressing it, you preclude the possibility of the best. Because no one can be a good person without integrating their capacity for aggression. Because without that capacity for aggression, you cannot say no. Because no means, if you really say it, no means there isn't anything that you can do to me that will make me change my mind. Or conversely, it means I will play for higher stakes than you will. And unless you've got your aggression integrated, there isn't a chance you can say that. And if you did, no one would take you seriously because they'd know it was just a show. So one of the most useful things that Jung did, I think, was to work on this idea of the integration of the shadow, because he was really interested in the idea of evil, right? Especially working with trying to parcel out what happened in Nazi Germany and during the Second World War. What do you do with the part of you that's aggressive and potentially malevolent? Do you just crush it? That's the superego response in some sense. Do you just put it behind you, so to speak? Is that a possibility? Or do you admit to its existence and bring it into the game? And that's, see, for Freud, in some sense, morality was superego clamping down on the id. And they were fundamentally opposed. Both Jung and Piaget had a different idea, and I think they were right. It's like, no, you invite the bad guys out to play. And so you're an aggressive hockey player, but it's disciplined aggression. That gives you access to a whole sorts of energy you wouldn't otherwise have. And then with regards to sexuality, it's like, well, untrammeled promiscuity doesn't constitute a virtue, but neither does unavoidable virginity, right? In fact, I think that's worse because it also masks itself with virtue. It's like, well, you should be able to do things that you wouldn't do. That's like the definition of a genuinely moral person. They could do it, but they don't. And that's not cowardice. And so you burn off the things that get in the way of that integration. Because if you burn something off, you might think, well, there's nothing left. It's like, that's not true. If it's dead wood, then you have room for new growth. And you want to be doing that on a fairly regular basis. That's the snake that sheds its skin and transforms itself, right? That's the death and resurrection from a psychological perspective. It's exactly the same idea. Now, we don't know the upper limit to that, right? Because we don't know what a person would be like if they let everything that they could let go, and only let in what was seemly, let's say. But you can see that. It's funny. We don't know that to some degree. You can see people start to do that without, that's not a rare experience. And people improve very rapidly. They can improve their lives very rapidly. A lot of it's low-hanging fruit. Like, if you just stop doing really stupid things that you know are stupid, your life improves a lot. So, and it frees you up. It also means there's an element there that's also associated with pride. Because people tend to take pride in who they are. And that's a bad idea, because that stops you from becoming who you could be. Because if you're proud of who you are, you won't let that go when it's necessary. You won't step away from it. And then you end up being your own parody, something like that. That's also a very bad idea. You want to be continually stepping away from your previous self. And so, and I guess part of that too is that you have to decide, are you order? Are you chaos? Or are you the process that mediates between them? And if you're the process that mediates between them, you are the thing that transforms. And that's the right attitude for a human being, because that's what we are. We're the thing that voluntarily confronts chaos and transforms. That's what we are. And so for better or worse, that's our deepest biological essence, you might say. And so you can let things go if you know that there's more growth to come. So